In the early months of 1952, in a Los Angeles courtroom, a judge listened to two lawyers argue about whether a 13-year-old girl should be permitted to board an airplane. The girl's name was Pia Lindström. Her father, a Swedish-born neurosurgeon, sat at one table. Her mother was not in the room. Her mother was in Italy, 3,000 miles in an ocean away, living with the man she had left her marriage for, raising a son the American public had decided was proof of moral corruption. The girl was not asked to speak. She was not asked what she wanted. She sat in a room built for adult disputes, while men in suits discussed her summer travel plans, as though she were a piece of evidence in a case the entire country had already tried and convicted. Outside the courthouse, newspaper reporters waited. They knew the girl's name. They knew her mother's name. Everyone did. The mother was Ingrid Bergman, the woman America had once trusted more than almost any face on screen. The woman the United States Senate had called a powerful influence for evil. The woman who had played saints and faithful wives and then left her husband and her daughter for an Italian director and a different life, and whose punishment had been exile from the industry, the country, and the child she had left behind. This is the story of what that exile did. Not to the legend, but to the 4 children who inherited it. One left behind in America, one born into scandal in Rome, twin girls delivered into flashbulbs before they had names. 4 lives shaped by the same mother, the same absences, and the question none of them could answer alone. What does it cost to be the child of a woman the world insists on forgiving? That moment, the child's life, argued over by adults who could not agree on whether she belonged to a mother or to a country's outrage, was not the beginning of this story. It was the point at which the private cost of Ingrid Bergman's choices became impossible to hide inside a courtroom, inside a custody file, inside the careful language of lawyers speaking about a 13-year-old girl as though she were evidence in a moral trial the entire Western world had decided to hold. But to understand how a Swedish actress and a girl named Pia ended up at the center of that fight, you have to go back further. Past the scandal, past Hollywood, past the letter that crossed an ocean and changed everything. You have to go back to Stockholm, to a father with a camera, to a child who learned before she could fully understand it that the people you love can disappear, and that a photograph is not the same thing as a person staying. This is the story of a family that was never one family. It is the story of 4 children, born on different continents, into different marriages, under different kinds of public scrutiny, who inherited the same mother and spent their lives trying to understand what that inheritance meant. It is the story of Pia, who was left behind, of Roberto, who was born into condemnation, of Isabella and Isota, twins delivered into flashbulbs before they had names the public would remember, and of the woman at the center, Ingrid Bergman, who wanted artistic freedom, romantic intensity, and motherhood, and who discovered that the world would let her have all 3 season, but never at the same time, and never without someone paying for it. The public eventually forgave her. The question this story asks is simpler and harder. What did her children have to forgive? It begins in Stockholm. Not with fame, but with absence. Ingrid Bergman was born on the 29th of August, 1915, in a city that would barely know her before the rest of the world claimed her. Her mother, Friedel Adler Bergman, was German-born. She died when Ingrid was not yet 3 years old. The child would have almost no memory of her. What she would have instead, and what would shape everything that followed, was the knowledge that a mother could be there and then not be there, and that life simply continued around the hole. Her father, Justus Samuel Bergman, was a shopkeeper and amateur artist. He was also, by every account that survives, devoted to his daughter in a way that was both warmth and compensation. He could not replace what Ingrid had lost, so he did something else. He recorded her. He photographed her constantly. He filmed her. He pointed a camera at a small girl and captured her playing, posing, looking back at him, as though the act of recording could make a life permanent in a way that life itself could not. There is something about that detail that is worth sitting with for a moment, because the woman Ingrid Bergman became, the actress who later filmed her own children obsessively, who made home movies on beaches and in gardens and on sets, who turned the camera on every child she bore as though she could gather their childhoods into reels and keep them safe. That woman was made in a flat in Stockholm by a father who taught her, without meaning to, that the camera was where love lived, that to be looked at was to be held, that the image could do what the body sometimes could not. Stay. Justus Bergman died when Ingrid was approximately 12 years old. She was then raised by relatives, Within the space of a decade, she had lost both parents. The orphan pattern matters, not because it excuses anything that came later, but because it establishes the emotional architecture of a woman who would spend the rest of her life moving toward intensity, toward love, toward art, toward the next role, the next country, the next man. While the people closest to her experienced her movement as departure, she was, by temperament, a performer before she was anything else. She entered the Royal Dramatic Theatre School in Stockholm at 17. She was tall, striking, unself-conscious in a way that cameras loved because it looked like honesty. The Swedish film industry found her quickly. She made nearly a dozen films in Sweden before she was 24, and then America called. The mythology of Ingrid Bergman's arrival in Hollywood rests on a single quality: naturalness. She was described consistently and by people who should have known better as unadorned, fresh, sincere. The woman on screen appeared to be the woman in life. No artifice, no distance between the face and the feeling. The American audience, trained on glamour, saw something they believed was real, and they trusted it the way people trust a doctor or a priest. They gave her not just their admiration, but their moral confidence. What the audience did not see, what the studio system was not designed to let them see, was the machinery behind the naturalness. When Bergman was tested for Whom the Bell Tolls, the instructions for how she should appear were detailed, exacting, and controlling. How she should be dressed, how she should be photographed, how her appearance should be corrected. The natural woman was being manufactured with as much precision as any other Hollywood product. The difference was that Bergman made the manufacturing invisible, and the audience believed the invisibility was truth. That belief would become the foundation of everything. It would make her one of the most beloved actresses of the 1940s. It would also make the scandal, when it came, land with a force that no ordinary affair could have produced. Because when Ingrid Bergman broke the image, she did not simply disappoint her audience. She made them feel they had been deceived by sincerity itself. But that was still years away. Before the scandal, before Italy, before the letter, there was Hollywood at its height, and there was a woman building a career that would define an era of American cinema. Intermezzo brought her to American screens in 1939. Casablanca in 1942 made her immortal. Gaslight in 1944 won her first Academy Award. Hitchcock used her in Spellbound and Notorious, films that understood her particular power, the ability to project vulnerability and intelligence at once, to make an audience feel that they were seeing a woman think. The Bells of St. Mary's placed her opposite Bing Crosby as a nun. Joan of Arc gave her a saint. The names of those films matter because they formed the scaffold of an image. By the late 1940s, Ingrid Bergman was not simply famous, she was trusted. She represented moral cleanliness on screen with a conviction that audiences mistook for biography. The woman who played the nun, the saint, the faithful wife in Casablanca, was assumed to be those things in private. And when the private reality turned out to be different, the betrayal felt personal to millions of people who had never met her. That is the dynasty's first foundation. Not land, not title, not inherited wealth, but image. Ingrid Bergman's legacy was built on celluloid and belief, and it would be inherited by 4 children who would each have to decide what to do with a mother who was also a myth. The second foundation was a marriage. In 1937, before Hollywood, Bergman married Peter Aron Lindström in Sweden. He was a dentist who would later retrain as a neurosurgeon, a man from the disciplined, structured, empirical world of medicine, methodical by temperament and increasingly uncomfortable with the chaos and exposure that came with his wife's rising fame. Their daughter, Friedel Pia Lindström, was born in Stockholm on the 20th of September, 1938. She was named in part after the mother Ingrid had lost. That naming carries its own weight. The child given a dead woman's name would later become the living reminder of what Ingrid Bergman left behind. The third foundation was artistic hunger, and it arrived in 1948 in the form of a film Bergman saw in a cinema. Rossellini's Rome, Open City, had been released in 1945 and it reached audiences around the world as a shock. Not the polished shock of a Hollywood drama, but the rough, urgent, morally ambiguous shock of a camera pointed at war-damaged streets, ordinary faces, and human behavior stripped of studio varnish. Rossellini was one of the architects of Italian neorealism, a movement that insisted cinema should look like life, not like a dream of life. And Ingrid Bergman, the most polished natural face in Hollywood, watched that film and recognized something she wanted: She would later say, and her daughter Isabella would repeat the story decades later, that seeing Rome, Open City, was one of the most important events of her life. She wanted to be part of what Rossellini was making. She wanted to step out of the Hollywood frame and into something rawer, truer, more dangerous. That desire would cost her almost everything. It would cost Pia most of all. But in 1948, the cost was still invisible. What was visible was a woman at the peak of American fame, sitting in a cinema, watching a film made by a man she had never met, and deciding that her life was about to change. She wrote to him. The letter crossed the Atlantic. It has been quoted and paraphrased so many times that its exact words have become part of cinema mythology, but its spirit was simple. She was a Swedish actress who spoke English and German, had only a little French, and knew almost nothing of Italian beyond two words. She offered herself to his cinema. The wit of it, the lightness, the flirtation barely concealed inside a professional offer, foreshadowed everything. She was reaching toward a man whose art promised truth, and she was doing it with charm. The charm would not protect her. The truth would not protect either of them. Roberto Rossellini was born on the 8th of May, 1906 in Rome, the son of a family connected to the building trade. He had entered cinema through documentaries and short films, and by the mid-1940s, he had become one of the most important directors in European cinema. Rome, Open City, and Paisan established his reputation not merely as a filmmaker, but as a moral voice, a man whose camera saw the world without the comforting filters of studio production. He was also, by every account, a man whose personal life was as restless and ungovernable as his artistic ambitions. He had been married before. He had children, Renzo, born of an earlier relationship, and Marco Romano, born of another. He was a man who formed families the way he formed films, with intensity, with conviction, and with the apparent expectation that what came next would be more important than what was being left behind. That pattern predates Ingrid Bergman, and it would survive her. After their marriage ended, Rossellini would move on to Sonali Dasgupta, with whom he would have another child and whose young son he would adopt, creating yet another household in the expanding, branching architecture of a man who seemed incapable of staying inside a single life. He was not a villain. He was not simple. He was an artist and an intellectual who believed that following his instincts was the same thing as being honest, and who left a trail of complicated domestic arrangements behind him like scripts from films he had already stopped directing. Between Bergman and Rossellini, the dynastic inheritance becomes clear. It was not money, it was not property. It was the inheritance of pattern, the parent who moves on, the child who stays behind, the camera that records what domestic life cannot contain, the image that survives the household. Pia inherited it from Ingrid, Isabella and Isoda and Roberto inherited it from both parents. The next generation would inherit it again, in softer form, on a farm on Long Island and in the pages of fashion magazines. The dynasty was not built on stone. It was built on film, on faces, on the compulsion to look and be looked at, and on the damage that compulsion left in the rooms where the cameras were not running. Now, the family must be understood not as a unit, but as a series of individuals, each carrying a different version of the same inheritance, each shaped by forces they did not choose. Ingrid Bergman was born on the 29th of August, 1915, and she died on the same date in 1982 in London on her 67th birthday. Between those two August days, she was an orphan, a student, a wife, a mother 4 times over, a Hollywood icon, a scandalized exile, a restored legend, and a woman who never stopped working. She wanted everything: artistic freedom, romantic passion, the love of her children, the admiration of audiences, and the right to live without being imprisoned by the image that had made her beloved. The documentary Ingrid Bergman, in her own words, draws on her letters, her diaries, and her home movies to construct a portrait of a woman for whom acting was not a profession, but something closer to respiration. She performed because performing was how she was alive. The cost was that when she was most alive on screen or on stage, she was often absent from the rooms where her children were growing up. When she was present, and the home movies show this, she was vivid, playful, warm, capable of an attention so focused it felt like sunlight. The children who appeared in that documentary, all 4 of them, spoke with the bittersweet precision of people who had loved someone they also had to share with the world. They had each learned the same lesson at different ages and in different countries, that their mother could be wonderful and elsewhere at the same time. Peter Aron Lindström was born on the 1st of March, 1907, in Sweden. He trained first as a dentist, then as a neurosurgeon, and moved with Bergman to the United States when her career required it. He was disciplined, private, and professionally serious, a man whose world was built on precision and control, who found himself married to a woman whose world was built on emotion and instinct and an industry that thrived on exposure. He managed her career for a time. He handled finances. He tried, in the way that methodical men sometimes try, to impose order on a life that was accelerating beyond the reach of order. When Bergman left for Italy, Petter became the wronged husband, and his response to that wrong defined Pia's childhood for years. He fought for custody. He won. He controlled access. Whether out of genuine protectiveness or something harder to name, possessiveness, humiliation, the rage of a man whose private life had been turned into public entertainment, he became the gatekeeper between Pia and her mother. He later remarried. He had more children. He built a separate, quieter life in California, and he died in 2000 at the age of 93. But in this story, his power lies in a single fact. He had the legal authority to decide when and whether Pia Lindström could see Ingrid Bergman, and for years, the answer was she could not. Pia Lindström was born on the 20th of September, 1938, in Stockholm. She was the first child. She was the one who remembered the before, the mother who was there, the household that had a shape, the life that made sense. She was 11 when Bergman left for Italy and the world cracked open. She was 13 when lawyers argued about her in a courtroom. She was a teenager navigating a custody battle that had become international spectacle, a girl whose mother's name appeared in headlines alongside words like evil and scandal and moral collapse, and who had to go to school the next morning. The wound was not only that Bergman left, it was that the leaving was public, narrated, consumed. Pia could not grieve privately because the world would not let her. What she did eventually was build. She grew into a woman of public composure. She became a television journalist, working as a reporter and anchor at WNBC in New York from 1973 to 1997, a career spanning nearly a quarter of a century. She received Emmy recognition and an Associated Press Award. She later produced Ingrid Bergman Remembered, a 1996 documentary in which the abandoned daughter became the custodian of the mother's image. There is something about that trajectory, from the child left behind to the war woman who narrates the mother's life for an audience, that contains the entire emotional architecture of this story. Pia did not disappear into the wound. She turned it into a career built on the very thing that had been denied her, the ability to control the public narrative. Roberto Ingmar Rossellini was born in early 1950, before Bergman's divorce from Petter was finalized. He was the child whose existence confirmed what gossip had alleged and what the American public had chosen to treat as a moral emergency. His birth was not merely a private event. It was evidence submitted to the court of public opinion by a press that understood exactly how much a baby born outside a dissolved marriage could sell. He did not choose to be a symbol. He was an infant, but the world had decided that his arrival meant something about his mother's character, and that meaning preceded him into every room he would ever enter. His life would be quieter than Isabella's, less public than Pia's, and largely absent from the front pages that had greeted his birth. He grew up in the complicated household of two famous parents, whose marriage was already under pressure by the time he could walk. He appears in family documentaries as witness, a presence, a man who carries a name that was once a scandal and is now simply his. Isabella Rossellini was born on the 18th of June, 1952, in Rome. She was born with her twin sister, Isotta, and their arrival was treated as a public event from the first hours. Press were invited to the hospital. Photographs were taken. The twins were introduced to the world before they had been introduced to sleep. Isabella would go on to become the most publicly visible of all four children. Actress, model, the face of Lancôme, David Lynch's collaborator in Blue Velvet, and later a woman who defied every attempt to categorize her by studying animal behavior, performing one-woman shows about ethology, and living on a farm on Long Island where she raised heritage breed chickens and collaborated with her daughter on food and agriculture projects. She inherited her mother's face and her father's intellectual restlessness. She also inherited the knowledge, absorbed in childhood, that a family could be loving and fragmented at the same time. In a recent interview, she described the arrangement after her parents' separation. The three Rossellini Bergman children lived in their own flat with a babysitter and a housekeeper. Bergman would come to sleep with them, but would also return to Paris. Roberto lived nearby with his new family. It was not abandonment, it was not stability. It was something in between. A life organized around departures and returns, presence that was intermittent, love that was real, but never architecturally sound. Isolta Ingrid Rossellini was born the same day, the same hour, in the same hospital room. She entered the same flashbulbs and the same public fascination. But her life moved in a different direction. Where Isabella stepped into cameras, Isolta stepped into libraries. She pursued scholarship, Italian literature, teaching positions at institutions including Columbia, Princeton, and New York University. She became the family's quieter custodian, the twin who inherited not the visible performance legacy, but the intellectual lineage, the love of language and preservation, the instinct to study rather than to perform. Her trajectory gives the story its necessary counterweight. Inheritance does not require imitation. Two children born at the same moment, into the same scandal, into the same household, can carry the same name into entirely different lives. These were the people. These were the forces. A mother who could not stop moving. A first husband who tried to hold everything still. A second husband who moved even faster than she did. A first daughter old enough to remember what was lost. A son born into headlines he had not written. Twin daughters delivered into a world that had already decided their family was extraordinary and broken. Now the family had to live inside what it had made. In the late 1930s, Bergman and Petter were a young Swedish couple in America, navigating the particular strangeness of a household in which one person's career was becoming enormous and the other person's authority was quietly contracting. Pia was small. The family was physically together. Bergman was making films that would become landmarks. Petter was training, managing, organizing. There were dinners, routines, the shape of a life that could have been ordinary if the woman at its center had been anyone else. But she was not anyone else. And the departures were already beginning, not yet to Italy, not yet to Rossellini, but to sets, to locations, to the consuming machinery of a career that required absence as a condition of its existence. Pia's earliest years were not years of crisis. They were years of accommodation. A child learns that her mother leaves and returns. A child learns that the leaving is called work, and that work is important, and that being important is what her mother does. A child learns that love is real and also intermittent. That is not trauma, not yet. It is preparation. Then Bergman saw Rome, open city. Then she wrote the letter. Then she traveled to Italy to make Stromboli with Roberto Rossellini, and the household that had been slowly organizing itself around one woman's absences discovered that the latest absence was not a departure. It was an ending. On a volcanic island in the Mediterranean, Ingrid Bergman fell in love with the director who had promised her a different kind of cinema. The affair began during production. It was not discreet, it was not managed. The machinery of Hollywood publicity, which had spent a decade constructing the image of St. Ingrid, had no mechanism for what was happening. The actress who had played a nun and a saint and the most faithful woman in Casablanca was sleeping with an Italian director on a remote island while her husband and daughter waited in America, and the story was already leaking. By the time the world learned there was a child on the way, there was already another child who had been left behind. Pia was in Los Angeles, her mother was in Italy, and between them lay not just an ocean, but a scandal that was about to become one of the largest moral spectacles in the history of American popular culture. The pregnancy could not be hidden. The marriage to Petter was not yet dissolved. And the public that had trusted Ingrid Bergman's face was about to discover that the sincerity they had believed in was, at best, incomplete. The photograph of the new family, Ingrid and Roberto and the baby, would soon exist. What it would not show was the 11-year-old girl on the other side of the world, watching her mother disappear into a life that did not include her. We tell the stories of what America built and how it fell apart. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to the story. The scandal, when it arrived, did not arrive quietly. It arrived in the United States Senate. But before the Senate, before the denunciation and the exile and the custody war that would define Pia Lindstrom's adolescence, there was a period, brief, bright, and now visible only in fragments, when the life Bergman was leaving behind had looked from the outside like something close to perfection. It is worth understanding what was lost because the people who lost it understood, and because the public fury that followed only makes sense if you grasp what the public believed it had been promised. In the early and mid-1940s, Ingrid Bergman's household in America had the outward shape of a successful immigrant family touched by extraordinary fortune. Petter was completing his medical training, remaking himself from a Swedish dentist into an American neurosurgeon with the same discipline he brought to everything. Pia was a small child in a home where her mother was famous and her father was serious, and the rhythm of life moved between ordinary domesticity and the extraordinary absences that filmmaking required. There were holidays, there were meals, there were the rituals that a child remembers not because they were dramatic, but because they were reliable. Bergman, when she was home, was the kind of mother the home movies would later prove she could be. Attentive, playful, physically present in a way that made the camera feel like an extension of affection rather than a substitute for it. She filmed Pia. She filmed gardens and swimming pools and afternoons that looked like any other afternoons in any other household where a parent was trying, between professional obligations, to be there. The films she was making during these years were not simply successful. They were culturally definitive. Casablanca in 1942 had given her Ilse Lund, a woman torn between love and duty, and the American audience had watched her choose duty and admired her for it. Gaslight in 1944 gave her a woman whose reality was being systematically dismantled by the man who claimed to love her, and she won her first Academy Award for the performance. Hitchcock cast her in Spellbound and then in Notorious, understanding something about her that other directors only intuited: that her face could hold contradictions. She could project trust and concealment at once. She could make an audience believe she was incapable of deception, while the plot required her to deceive. The Bells of St. Mary's placed her in a nun's habit opposite Bing Crosby, and the American public, which had already decided she was morally transparent, saw the habit as confirmation. Joan of Arc in 1948 went further. She played a saint. The role and the reputation fuse. Ingrid Bergman was not merely an actress who took virtuous parts. She had become, in the public imagination, a woman whose virtue was factual. That was the scaffold. That was what stood above the private reality. And the private reality, even before Roberto Rossellini entered the story, was more complicated than the scaffold could hold. Petter Lindstrom was not a bad husband. He was a man whose idea of a well-ordered life depended on control, on structure, on the belief that discipline could govern circumstance. He managed Bergman's professional affairs. He handled contracts and money and the logistics of a career that was growing beyond the reach of any single household. But management is not the same thing as partnership, and what Bergman needed and what she was beginning to understand she needed was not someone to organize her life, but someone to match the scale of her restlessness. Petter's seriousness, which had once felt like stability, was beginning to feel like constraint. His authority over business matters was beginning to feel like authority over her. The household was not collapsing, it was calcifying, and the woman inside it was becoming aware, in the way that restless people become aware, that the shape of her life was no longer the shape of her desire. Pia, who was a child, experienced none of this as ideology. She experienced it as atmosphere: a father who was precise and present, a mother who was warm and increasingly elsewhere. The departures for films were normal. The returns were celebrated. The tension between her parents was the kind of tension that children absorb without naming, the way they absorb weather. She did not know, at 7 or 8 or 9, that the architecture of her family was already under strain. She knew that her mother left for work and came back. That was the pattern. That was what she trusted. The cracks beneath were not dramatic. They were structural. Bergman's ambition was not the kind that could be contained inside a single marriage, a single country, a single studio system. She had played every kind of woman Hollywood would offer her, and she had done it with enough brilliance that the roles had begun to feel like rooms she had already furnished. She wanted something else. She wanted the kind of cinema she had seen in Rome, open city, raw, unglamorous, morally uncertain, alive in a way that polished Hollywood productions were not. She wanted to be directed by someone who saw the world differently from the men who had been pointing cameras at her for a decade. She wanted, though she may not have used the word, liberation. And the particular cruelty of her situation was that the liberation she craved could only be achieved by leaving the people who depended on her presence. The letter to Rossellini was sent. The invitation was accepted. And in the spring of 1949, Ingrid Bergman traveled to Italy to make Stromboli. What happened on Stromboli was not simply an affair. It was a collision between two extraordinary forces: an actress at the height of her fame and a director at the height of his artistic authority, conducted on a volcanic island in the Tyrrhenian Sea, surrounded by a film crew, a local population, and the growing attention of a press corps that could smell the story before anyone confirmed it. Rossellini directed with intensity and improvisation. He did not use conventional scripts. He demanded presence, reaction, authenticity. For Bergman, trained in the precision of Hollywood studio work, the experience was both thrilling and disorienting. She was being asked to be, not to perform. And the man asking her was magnetic, brilliant, volatile, and in love with her. The affair became, the film became, the scandal became the life. It was not possible to separate the professional from the personal because Rossellini made no such separation. His cinema was his existence. His lovers were his collaborators. His children would be born into the same households where films were being planned. For Bergman, falling in love with Rossellini meant falling out of everything that had held her life in place. The marriage, the custody arrangement, the career, the moral contract with the American audience, and the daily presence of a daughter who was waiting for her to come home. She did not come home. By the end of 1949, Bergman was pregnant with Rossellini's child. She was still legally married to Peter Lindstrom. She was still, in the eyes of the American public, the woman who had played the saint. And the machinery of moral judgment, which had been building pressure since the first rumors from Stromboli, was about to discharge with a force that would reshape her life, her family, and the way America talked about women, sexuality, and the ownership of public figures. On the 2nd of February 1950, Bergman gave birth to a son in Rome. He was named Roberto Ingmar Rossellini. He weighed the normal weight of a normal infant, and he entered the world carrying a burden that no infant should carry. He was proof. His birth confirmed what gossip had alleged, what the press had insinuated, and what the American moral establishment had been preparing to punish. The baby had not committed any offense. He had simply been born. But in the logic of 1950s morality, his existence was the evidence that convicted his mother. The American reaction was not merely disapproval, it was fury, and the fury was institutional. On the 14th of March, 1950, Senator Edwin C. Johnson of Colorado took the floor of the United States Senate and delivered a denunciation of Ingrid Bergman that remains one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of American cultural politics. He called her, in the language of the congressional record, a powerful influence for evil. He proposed that the entertainment industry should be subjected to a moral licensing system to prevent such outrages. He spoke about an actress's private life, her pregnancy, her love affair, her departure from her husband, as though these were matters of national security, as though the reproductive choices of a Swedish-born woman living in Italy constituted a threat to the moral infrastructure of the United States. There is something about that moment that requires careful attention. A United States senator stood in the most powerful legislative chamber in the world and used the birth of a child as a weapon against a woman whose crime was that she had fallen in love with someone who was not her husband. The punishment was not merely words, the punishment was exile. Bergman's films were pulled from circulation in some markets. She was effectively barred from Hollywood. She was denounced in newspapers, from pulpits, in living rooms. The woman who had embodied sincerity was now being held to the standard of sincerity, and the standard demanded that she be destroyed for failing to be the character she had played. The disproportionality was the point. The public did not react this way to ordinary infidelity. They reacted this way because they felt personally betrayed. They had trusted Bergman's face. They had believed the naturalness. They had invested their moral confidence in a woman they had never met. And when she turned out to be human, complicated, passionate, capable of choices that broke the image, they experienced it as fraud. The fury was the fury of people who had confused a performance with a promise. Peter Lindstrom's response hardened the fracture into something permanent. He filed for divorce on the grounds of desertion. He fought for sole custody of Pia. He won. And having won, he used his authority to control Pia's access to her mother with a rigidity that would define the next several years of both their lives. Whether this was protection or punishment or some alloy of both, the practical effect was the same. Pia Lindstrom, who was 11 years old when her mother left for Italy and 12 when her brother Roberto was born, was separated from Ingrid Bergman by a legal wall that neither of them had the power to breach. The courtroom battles over visitation became part of the public spectacle. Pia was not simply a child caught between two parents. She was a character in a story the world was telling about fallen women and wronged husbands and the children who pay for adult desires. The question of whether she could travel to Italy to visit her mother was argued by lawyers and reported in magazines. Time covered the dispute. Newspapers editorialized. Pia's name appeared in print alongside words no child should have to read about her own mother. She was 13 years old and she was already learning the lesson that would shape her entire adult life, that a private wound in a famous family is never allowed to be private. What Pia wanted at 13 is not fully recorded and should not be invented. What is known is that children in custody disputes want, with a simplicity that courts cannot accommodate, for the fighting to stop. Whether she wanted to see her mother or wanted to punish her mother or wanted both at once, and children are entirely capable of wanting both at once, the adults around her were not asking what she wanted. They were arguing about what she represented. Bergman in Italy was building a new life with a speed that looked from the outside like either courage or callousness, depending on which side of the Atlantic you stood. She married Rossellini on the 24th of May, 1950, just months after Roberto's birth and shortly after the Mexican proxy divorce from Petter was finalized. The marriage was a statement. She was not retreating. She was not apologizing. She was choosing the life she wanted, even if the cost included the one she had left behind. The early years of the Rossellini Bergman family in Italy should not be depicted as loveless or entirely chaotic. There was genuine excitement, there was artistic collaboration, there was the particular intensity of two people who had sacrificed enormous amounts to be together and who were, at least initially, sustained by the belief that what they were creating, in cinema and in family, justified the destruction. They lived in Rome and at a property in Santa Marinella on the coast north of the city. Rossellini directed Bergman in films that were nothing like what she had made in Hollywood. Stromboli, Europe 51, Journey to Italy, Fear, Joan of Arc at the Stake. These were austere, demanding, artistically ambitious works that traded Hollywood's emotional accessibility for something colder and more searching. They were not commercial successes. They were, in many cases, critical disappointments at the time, though later generations of filmmakers, including the directors of the French New Wave, would recognize them as pioneering. For Bergman, the artistic liberation she had sought came with its own form of captivity. Rossellini's authority as a director was inseparable from his authority as a husband, and the financial uncertainty of European art cinema was a far cry from the studio contracts that had once given her career its infrastructure. But there were also home movies. There were children on beaches. There was Roberto growing, walking, speaking Italian, becoming a boy in a household that was famous and strange and at its best, full of the kind of intellectual vitality that both his parents generated when they were engaged. And then, on the 18th of June, 1952, the twins arrived. Isabella and Isara were born in Rome, and their entrance into the world was treated as a public event before they had drawn their first full breaths. Press were invited. Photographs were taken at the hospital. The babies were displayed. It was the second-generation version of the same exposure that had defined the scandal. Pia had been made public by her mother's departure. The twins were made public by their arrival. The family now had a shape. Bergman and Rossellini and Roberto and Isabella and Isara in Italy, Pia and Petter in America, two households, two continents, one woman's name linking them, and a chasm of scandal, custody, and unresolved grief running between them. The early consequences of the fracture were not static. They were accumulating. Every month that Pia spent separated from her mother was a month in which the relationship between them was being rewritten, not by choice, but by absence. A child of 12 is not the same person at 13 or 14 or 15. The mother Pia remembered was becoming, year by year, a figure she would have to relearn. And the mother Pia was being asked to relearn was no longer the Hollywood actress who had left. She was now the woman with 3 other children, a new husband, a new language, a new country, and a life that had reformed itself around a center that did not include her first daughter. Bergman wrote letters. She sent messages. She attempted through the legal and emotional obstacles that Petter's custody arrangement imposed to maintain contact. But contact is not presence, and letters are not a mother putting a child to bed. The distance was not only geographical, it was existential. Pia was growing up in a world where her mother's name meant scandal, where classmates and strangers and newspaper headlines all carried a version of her family's story that she had not authored and could not correct. She was learning to compose herself. She was learning the particular discipline of a child who must carry a famous wound in public. She was becoming already the poised, controlled woman she would later be on television. Not because television was her destiny, but because composure was the only tool available to a girl whose private life kept appearing in other people's mouths. In Rome, the Rossellini Bergman household was full and fragile. 3 children, 2 careers, 1 marriage built on artistic intensity and personal rupture, sustained by the belief that passion and talent would be enough to hold it all together. There were dinners, there were friends and collaborators visiting. There was the vivid, disordered life of two artists who treated the world as raw material for their work and their household as an extension of their creative process. Roberto Rossellini directed, Bergman acted, the children absorbed. And the outside world, which had punished Bergman for leaving her first family, watched the second family with the particular attentiveness of an audience that has already decided the ending. What the audience could not yet see, what even the family could not yet fully see, was that the pattern was already repeating. Rossellini was not a man who stayed inside one life. He was intellectually voracious, emotionally restless, and constitutionally unable to resist the next fascination, whether it was a film, an idea, or a woman. The qualities that had made him extraordinary as a director, the refusal to be bound by convention, the insistence on following instinct wherever it led, were the same qualities that made him unreliable as a husband and a father. He had left families before Bergman. He would leave this one too. But in 1952 and 1953, the household was still holding. The twins were small. Roberto was a toddler becoming a boy. Bergman was working, filming, adapting to a European rhythm that was less structured and less lucrative than Hollywood, but that offered her the artistic engagement she had crossed an ocean to find. The home movies from this period, the ones that would later appear in Stig Björkman's documentary, show a woman with children around her, a woman filming and being filmed, a woman doing what her father had done with his camera in Stockholm, trying to hold life in place by recording it. There is something about those home movies that resists easy interpretation. They are proof that Bergman loved her children. They are proof that she was there, at least some of the time, with a camera and a smile and the kind of focused attention that makes a child feel seen. They are also proof that the camera was always present, that even in the most intimate domestic moments, there was an apparatus of observation, a habit of recording, a compulsion to turn life into footage. The woman who had been filmed by her father, who had been filmed by studios, who had been filmed by Rossellini, turned the camera on her own children as though the act of looking through a lens was the most natural way to love. It may have been the only way she knew. What the home movies do not show is Pia. She is not in them. She is not on the Italian beaches, not in the Roman gardens, not in the frames where Roberto and Isabella and Isotta play and grow. She is the absence in the archive, the first child, the one who was left on the other side of the ocean, growing up in a household where the camera had stopped rolling and the mother had not come back. The family that appeared in those films looked complete. 3 children, 2 artists, a life in Italy that was chaotic and cultured and full. But a family is not a frame. And outside the frame, across the Atlantic, in a house in America, where a neurosurgeon was raising a daughter alone, the unfinished business of Ingrid Bergman's first life was waiting. It would wait for 7 years. And when the reunion finally came, it would not be simple, and it would not be repair. It would be the beginning of a different kind of reckoning, the kind that happens when a child who has been left behind grows old enough to ask why. The Italian family held, the American daughter waited. And the distance between them, which was not only miles but years and silence, and the accumulated weight of a scandal that had made one woman's choices into the whole world's argument, was becoming the kind of distance that no letter, no legal arrangement, and no amount of love could fully cross. The Rossellini-Bergman marriage was not merely a union between two people. It was a collaboration, a creative experiment, a domestic arrangement built on the premise that artistic truth and personal truth were the same thing. For a time, that premise held. Then it began to crack from the inside, and the cracks ran through the children. The films they made together between 1949 and 1954 tell the story of the marriage more honestly than any biography. Stromboli, the first, was Chaos and Passion, a production that mirrored the affair, shot on a volcanic island with a crew that knew what was happening between director and star before the world did. Europe 51 in 1952 was something more troubling. A film about a wealthy woman who, after the death of her child, abandons her comfortable life to serve the poor and is declared insane by the people who cannot understand her choices. There is a biographical echo in that premise that the script should not overstate, but should not ignore either. Bergman was playing a woman whose radical departure from expectation is punished by the people around her. She knew something about that. Journey to Italy, released in 1954, went further. It followed a married English couple, played by Bergman and George Sanders, driving through the landscape around Naples, their relationship deteriorating in real time, the silences between them becoming more articulate than their conversations. The film was cool, observational, almost unbearably honest about the way two intelligent people can inhabit the same space and experience entirely different loneliness. It was not a success when it was released. Audiences trained on Hollywood narrative did not know what to do with a film in which almost nothing happened and everything was felt. But decades later, directors would recognize it as one of the most important films ever made about marriage. Martin Scorsese would cite it. The French New Wave directors treated it as a foundational text. The irony was exact. The film that most truthfully captured the disintegration of a relationship was made by two people whose own relationship was disintegrating, and the world refused to see it until the marriage and the artistic partnership were already over. Fear, made in 1954, was the last of their collaborations. It was a film about a woman being blackmailed over an affair, trapped between guilt and the person exploiting that guilt. By the time it was completed, the creative partnership that had drawn Bergman across the Atlantic was exhausted. The films had not found the audiences Bergman had been accustomed to in Hollywood. The critical reception had been at best mixed and often hostile. The financial returns were negligible. Bergman had left the most commercially successful career in American cinema to make art films that almost no one wanted to see. And the man she had left everything for was already turning his attention elsewhere. Not yet to another woman, but to other intellectual projects, other ambitions, the restless forward motion that defined Roberto Rossellini as surely as the camera defined Bergman. For the children, the creative partnership was simply the texture of daily life. Roberto, Isabella, and Isotta grew up in a household where their parents' work and their parents' marriage were indistinguishable. The conversations at dinner were about films. The visitors were directors, writers, intellectuals. The arguments were about shots and scenes and the nature of reality on screen. It was, in its way, an extraordinary education, a childhood steeped in ideas and art, and the company of people who treated creative ambition as the highest human activity. But it was also a childhood in which the children's needs were subordinate to the parents' projects, in which domestic stability was always conditional on professional momentum, and in which the adults in the room were often too consumed by their own collaboration to notice that the collaboration was failing. Roberto Rossellini, the son, not the father, was 4 and 5 and 6 during these years. He was old enough to be present in the household, old enough to absorb its atmosphere, too young to understand why his parents argued, or why his father sometimes disappeared into work for days, or why his mother sometimes had a particular quality of sadness that the home movies do not capture. He was the firstborn of this second family, the child who had arrived in scandal and was now living in the complicated aftermath of that scandal, surrounded by famous people and artistic intensity, and the particular instability of a home built on passion rather than on structure. Isabella and Isotta were toddlers becoming small children. They were learning Italian and French. They were moving between Rome and Santa Marinella and increasingly Paris, where Bergman was beginning to re-establish connections to the European theatrical world that might offer her the work Rossellini's films no longer provided. The twins were too young to understand the geography of their childhood as anything other than normal. All children assume that the way they live is the way the world works. Isabella and Isotta assumed that having two famous parents, a brother born into headlines, a half-sister in America they rarely saw, a home that moved between countries, and a domestic life organized around art and argument and intermittent tenderness was simply what family meant. But the structure was weakening. Rossellini's attention was diffusing. His films with Bergman had not achieved what either of them had hoped, and his response was not to consolidate but to expand, to move toward television, toward documentary, toward educational projects that would eventually take him to India. He was a man whose genius lay in seeing new possibilities, and the cost of that genius was that he could not remain interested in any single possibility for long. The marriage that had begun as a creative and romantic revolution was becoming for Bergman a different kind of confinement. She had left Hollywood's control only to find herself inside Rossellini's orbit, financially dependent on a man whose projects did not generate income, professionally diminished by years of work that the public had rejected, and personally isolated from the English-speaking world that had been her audience. There is a particular kind of loneliness available to a woman who has sacrificed everything for a love that turns out to be impermanent. Bergman experienced it in Italy in the mid-1950s. She was not unloved. She was not mistreated in any obvious way. She was simply discovering that the man she had chosen was not a man who could be chosen permanently, because permanence was antithetical to his nature. The qualities that had made Rossellini's art revolutionary, the refusal to be bound, the insistence on following instinct, were the same qualities that would eventually lead him out of the marriage and into another life. And then there was Pia. The separation between Bergman and her first daughter had lasted years. It was not a clean separation. There were legal maneuvers, letters, intermediaries, the grinding machinery of a custody arrangement administered by a man who had every legal right to control access and who used that right with a thoroughness that left Bergman functionally cut off from the child she had borne first. Pia was growing up in California. She was becoming a teenager. She was navigating the American school system as the daughter of the most scandalized woman in the country, carrying a surname that invited questions she could not answer without exposing her own pain. She was becoming, by necessity, self-contained. The composure that would later define her professional life was being forged in these years, not out of choice, but out of the absence of any alternative. The reunion came in 1957. Pia, who was then 18 or close to it, traveled to see her mother. The meeting took place in Europe. The details of what was said, what was felt, what silence held the room before anyone spoke, are not fully public and should not be fabricated. But the emotional reality of such a reunion, a daughter seeing a mother after years of enforced separation in a foreign country surrounded by a second family the daughter had never been part of, does not require invention. It requires honesty. Pia was meeting not just the mother who had left, but the mother who had built a new life, with new children, in a new language, on a new continent. The reunion was not a simple return. It was an encounter between two people who had each been changed by the years of absence and who now had to discover whether the bond that had been interrupted could survive the interruption. It could, but it could not erase what had been lost. A reunion after childhood separation is also proof of the separation. It is the evidence that something was broken, presented in the form of an attempt to repair. Pia and Bergman reconnected. They would build a relationship that would last the rest of Bergman's life. But the relationship would always contain, somewhere inside its architecture, the knowledge that there had been years when it did not exist. That is the inheritance Pia carried. Not anger necessarily, not permanent estrangement, but the awareness that her mother had chosen, and that the choice had consequences, and that no amount of later warmth could retroactively fill the space where a 12-year-old girl had waited for a letter, a call, a visit, a mother who did not come. The second fracture arrived in 1957, the same year as the reunion. It arrived in the form of a woman named Sonali Dasgupta. Roberto Rossellini had traveled to India. He had gone, characteristically, in pursuit of a new intellectual fascination, the subcontinent's history, its culture, the possibility of making films and television that engaged with a world beyond Europe's borders. He was 51 years old. He was still married to Bergman. He was still the father of 3 children who lived between Rome and Paris and the Italian coast. And in India, he met a 27-year-old screenwriter named Sonali Dasgupta, and the pattern that had defined his life, the pattern of passionate attachment followed by passionate departure, repeated itself with an exactness that would have been poetic if it had not been devastating. The affair was not discreet. Rossellini's affairs were never discreet, because discretion implied that he believed there was something to hide, and Rossellini's particular moral framework held that following desire was a form of honesty. He and Bergman separated. The marriage that had caused one of the 20th century's great scandals ended, not with a scandal of equal magnitude, but with the quieter devastation of a woman discovering that the man she had sacrificed her first life for was constitutionally incapable of fidelity to any single life. There is a symmetry in this that the script should name without overworking. Bergman had been the woman for whom Rossellini left his previous arrangements. Now she was the woman being left. The mechanism was identical. The emotional experience was reversed, and the children, all of the children, across all of the households, absorbed the symmetry. Roberto, Isabella, and Isotta lost the household they had known, imperfect as it was. Pia, who had just reconnected with her mother, watched the second family fracture along the same lines that had destroyed the first. The pattern was the inheritance. Not money, not property, not title. Repetition. The practical consequences of the separation were managed with a particular arrangement that Isabella would describe decades later with the matter-of-factness of someone who had long ago stopped expecting conventional domesticity. The three Rossellini Bergman children, Roberto, Isabella, and Isotta, were installed in their own flat. They had a babysitter, they had a housekeeper. Their mother came to sleep with them, but also returned to Paris, where she was rebuilding her career. Their father lived nearby, in another household, with Sonali Dasgupta. He was present, he visited. He was, by Isabella's later account, a constant figure in their lives, not an absent one, but he was a constant figure who lived elsewhere, with another woman, in another arrangement, while his children from the previous arrangement occupied their own separate domestic space. That image, three children in a flat, staff maintaining routine, a mother arriving and departing, a father nearby but in a different household, is one of the most important in the entire story. It is not abandonment, it is not cruelty, it is something more ambiguous and more common than either. It is a family that has been reorganized around adult choices, with children at the center of an arrangement they did not design and cannot control. There is love in it. There is also the fundamental instability of a childhood in which no single household is permanent, in which the people who are supposed to be the architecture are instead visitors, and in which routine is maintained not by parents, but by paid staff who are doing their best to provide what the family structure will not. Isabella, who would grow into the most articulate interpreter of both her parents' legacies, later said that she did not feel sharp divisions among the half siblings during summers. The children from Rossellini's various relationships mingled. There were gatherings. There was, in the Italian and European way, an extended family sensibility that blurred the edges between households. But blurred edges are not the same thing as solid ground. And the fact that the children adapted does not mean the adaptation was costless. Children are resilient because they have no choice. Resilience is not the absence of damage, it is the presence of survival in its wake. Isotta absorbed the same household, the same arrangement, the same arrivals and departures, but where Isabella would later turn outward, toward cameras, toward performance, toward the public interpretation of her family's story, Isotta turned inward. She was the twin who chose books over flashbulbs, scholarship over spectacle, the life of the mind over the life of the image. Her trajectory began in these years, in that flat, in the space between a mother who came and went and a father who lived nearby, and an education that was becoming for Isotta the most reliable structure in a life that offered little architectural certainty. She would pursue Italian literature. She would teach at Columbia, at Princeton, at New York University. She would become the family member whose name appeared least often in magazines and most often in university catalogs. The choice was not accidental. It was, in its own way, a response to the same forces that pushed Isabella toward the camera. When your childhood is defined by exposure and instability, you either master the exposure or you step away from it. Isotta stepped away. Roberto, the son, was now 7 or 8. He was the oldest of the Rossellini Bergman children and the one whose birth had carried the heaviest symbolic weight. He had been scandal made flesh, the proof of what gossip alleged, the infant whose arrival had prompted a United States senator to stand on the floor of Congress and call his mother evil. None of that had been his choice. None of it had been his fault. And now, at 7 or 8, he was living in a flat with his sisters, watched over by staff, visited by parents who loved him but did not live together, in a city that had been his entire world, but that was about to become one of several addresses in a life that would be, like his father's, characterized by movement rather than by roots. The paths were diverging. Bergman was moving toward professional redemption. The instrument of that redemption was a film called Anastasia, released in 1956, a year before the final separation from Rossellini. In it, Bergman played a woman who might or might not be the surviving daughter of the murdered Russian Tsar, a role that required her to be simultaneously regal and damaged, convincing and uncertain, a woman whose identity was a question that the audience would spend the film trying to answer. It was in every sense a comeback. She had been exiled from Hollywood for 6 years. She had made art films that almost nobody watched. She had been denounced by a senator and abandoned by an industry. And now she was being offered a part that seemed to have been written for her specific situation. A woman returning from exile, claiming an identity the world was not sure she deserved, asking to be believed again. She won the Academy Award for it, her second Oscar. Cary Grant accepted the statuette on her behalf because Bergman was still in Europe, still not fully returned to the American world that had expelled her. The award was more than professional recognition. It was the beginning of absolution. The American public, which had punished her with a ferocity that now seems almost incomprehensible, was preparing to take her back. The moral fury of 1950 was beginning to cool. The woman who had been called a powerful influence for evil was being reintroduced to the culture as a great actress who had suffered and survived. But the absolution was for the public Bergman. It was for the actress, the image, the face on screen that the audience wanted to trust again. It was not for the mother. It was not for the woman whose first daughter had spent years on the wrong side of a custody wall. It was not for the 3 children in a Roman flat whose household had just dissolved. The world was preparing to forgive Ingrid Bergman for the scandal. Nobody was preparing to forgive the cost the scandal had imposed on the people who had not chosen it. Rossellini, meanwhile, was building yet another life. He married Sonali Dasgupta. They had a daughter. He adopted her young son. The man whose artistic vision had once promised to strip cinema of its illusions was now living a private life that seemed to generate illusions of its own. Each new family presented as the authentic one. Each previous family left to reorganize itself around the departure. He remained intellectually engaged. He turned toward television and educational filmmaking. He traveled. He theorized. He was not a negligible father. Isabella would later insist that he was present, that he cared, that he engaged with his children's lives and minds. But present and reliable are different things. And the children of Roberto Rossellini, all of them, across all of his households, grew up understanding that their father's presence was genuine and also conditional on his own restless trajectory. The divergence was now visible. Pia, in America, was moving from adolescence into young adulthood. She had reunited with her mother, but the reunion had not restored what the separation had taken. She was building her own life with her own resources in a country that associated her mother's name with sin and redemption in roughly equal measure. She was learning, or had already learned, that the only narrative she could control was the one she constructed herself. The career in journalism was still years away, but the impulse behind it, the desire to be the person holding the microphone rather than the person being talked about, was already forming. Isabella and Isotta were 5 years old. They were twins in a flat in Rome with a babysitter and a housekeeper, and they were beginning to develop the separate identities that would carry them into vastly different adult lives. One was already the more outward child, the one who looked at the camera with the directness that would later become famous. The other was already the quieter one, the one who turned toward the interior, who would find her home in words on paper rather than images on screen. Roberto, at 7 or 8, was the boy in the middle, older than his sisters, younger than his half-sister across the Atlantic, the son of 2 people whose fame had preceded him into every room and whose separation had now restructured his daily life. He was not yet the man he would become. He was a child adapting, as children do, to whatever arrangement the adults around him constructed, because adapting was the only option available. And Bergman was standing at the threshold of a second career. Anastasia had opened the door. The Academy Award had confirmed that the door would stay open. Ahead of her lay decades of work. Theater in London and Paris, films with directors who respected her talent, an eventual return to Hollywood that would be complete enough to win her a 3rd Oscar. She would marry again, this time to Lars Schmidt, a Swedish theatrical producer whose temperament was calmer and whose expectations were more modest, and who would provide a kind of stability, or at least a base of operations, that neither Petter nor Roberto had offered. She would rebuild. She would be celebrated. She would, in the final estimation of the American Film Institute, be ranked 4th among the greatest female screen legends in American cinema history. But none of that was visible yet in 1957. What was visible was a woman at the hinge of her life, the Italian years ending, the Restoration beginning, the children scattered across continents and custody arrangements, the pattern of departure and return about to enter its next iteration. She was leaving again. Not leaving a marriage this time, but leaving a chapter. And her children, as always, were left to make sense of the chapter without her. America was preparing to forgive Ingrid Bergman. Her children were still living with what forgiveness could not restore. The years after the Rossellini separation were not a single story. They were 4 stories running in parallel, occasionally intersecting, each shaped by the same origin but moving toward different destinations. Bergman's restoration was the loudest of those stories, the one the public could follow, the one that had a narrative arc the world understood: fall, exile, return, triumph. The children's stories were quieter, more private, and far more complicated, because children do not experience a parent's redemption the way an audience does. An audience sees a comeback. A child sees a mother who is working again, traveling again, leaving again. and who is now being praised for the same qualities: dedication, intensity, refusal to be contained, and that had made her absence so painful in the first place. Bergman's marriage to Lars Schmidt took place in 1958, a year after the separation from Rossellini. Schmidt was Swedish, a theatrical producer, a man whose world was the stage rather than the screen, but whose temperament was more measured and more accommodating than either of the men Bergman had married before. He was not Petter's rigidity. He was not Rossellini's volatility. He was in some ways the answer to a question Bergman had been asking since she left Stockholm. Could she have a partnership that did not require her to be controlled or to be consumed? Schmidt offered stability, a home base, a companionship that could coexist with her career rather than competing with it. They lived between Paris and a small island off the coast of Sweden. The marriage would last until 1975, when they divorced, but it provided Bergman with something she had not had in years: a center of gravity that was not a film set. For Pia, now approaching 20, the restoration of her mother's career was a complicated gift. It meant Bergman was more accessible, more present in the English-speaking world, more able to maintain contact. It also meant that the mother who had been absent was now absent in a different way. Absent because she was working, touring, performing, building the second half of a career that would eventually be regarded as one of the most remarkable in cinema history. Pia's relationship with Bergman in these years was real but fragile, a bond that had been broken and repaired, and that now required the kind of careful maintenance that relationships between adults and their grown children require when the childhood was not what it should have been. They saw each other, they spoke, they tried, but trying is not the same as having, and the ease that might have existed between a mother and a first daughter who had grown up together, the shared references, the accumulated dailiness, the simple knowledge of each other's habits and moods, was not available to them. That ease had been spent in the years of separation. What remained was effort and love, and the particular tenderness of two people who know they cannot recover what was lost, but who refuse to let the loss be the whole story. Pia was building her own life with a determination that should be understood not as recovery, but as construction. She was not rebuilding something that had been destroyed. She was building something that had never existed, an identity separate from her mother's fame, her father's control, and the scandal that had defined her childhood. She moved through education and early professional life with the self-containment that had become her defining characteristic. She was not brittle, she was composed. There is a difference. Brittleness breaks under pressure, composure holds, and the holding is a choice made every day, in every room, in every conversation, where someone might ask about her mother, and she must decide how much to reveal and how much to protect. The Rossellini children, Roberto, Isabella, and Isotta, were growing up in the peculiar ecosystem that their parents' separation had created. They moved between addresses. They absorbed languages. They spent time with their mother when she was in Europe and time in the care of the babysitter and housekeeper when she was not. Their father was nearby, living with Sonali Dasgupta and their growing family, present enough that Isabella could later say he was a constant in her life, but absent enough that the constancy was punctuated by the same kind of gaps that defined their mother's presence. They spent summers in gatherings that included half-siblings from Rossellini's other relationships: Renzo, who was Roberto's eldest son from before Bergman, and the children from the Dasgupta marriage. The result was not a single family, but a constellation, related people orbiting the same centers of gravity, connected by blood and by the outsized personalities of two parents who had generated more households than either of them could simultaneously inhabit. Isabella, in these years, was becoming the child who most obviously carried both parents' inheritance. She had Bergman's face, or rather, she had a version of it, recognizable and distinct, the kind of resemblance that invites comparison and resists it at the same time. She had Rossellini's intellectual curiosity, his restlessness, his refusal to accept that a person should be only one thing. She was growing up in Rome and Paris and at the coast, absorbing art and cinema and the particular European confidence that comes from being raised by people who treat culture as the air they breathe rather than as an acquisition. She was not yet a model. She was not yet an actress. She was a girl becoming a young woman in a household that was strange and rich and unstable, and she was watching with the attentiveness that children of famous parents develop as a survival skill, the way her mother and father navigated the world. Isotta was developing along a parallel but distinct track. She was the twin who read. She was the twin who studied. She was the twin for whom the life of the mind was not a retreat from the family's public intensity, but an alternative to it. A space where she could exist as herself rather than as a Rossellini daughter, or a Bergman grandchild, or a twin who looked like another twin who looked like their mother. Her path toward scholarship was already forming in these years, in the quiet hours when Isabella was turned outward and Isotta was turned inward, in the books she chose and the questions she asked, and the instinct already visible that her contribution to the family legacy would be preservation rather than performance. Roberto, the son, was moving through adolescence as the least publicly defined of the Rossellini Bergman children. He did not have Pia's dramatic origin story of abandonment and reunion. He did not have Isabella's emerging visibility. He did not have Isotta's scholarly distinction. He was the middle figure, the boy who had been born into the scandal and who was now growing up in its long aftermath, carrying a name that meant different things in different rooms: son of the great director, son of the great actress, the child whose birth had prompted a senator to stand up and call his mother evil, and trying to find, somewhere inside all of those imposed meanings, a self that was simply his. Bergman's career in the 1960s and 70s was the career of a woman who had been given a second chance and who intended to use every hour of it. She worked on stage in London and Paris. She made films with directors who sought her out, not for the scandal, but for the talent, the precision, the emotional transparency, the ability to hold a camera's attention with a quality that was not beauty alone, but something closer to presence. She appeared in films that were not all masterpieces, but that kept her in front of audiences and critics who were being asked implicitly to separate the artist from the biography. Some of those films succeeded, others did not, but the cumulative effect was restoration. Year by year, performance by performance, the public image of Ingrid Bergman was being rebuilt from scandalized exile to enduring legend. The children experienced this restoration as a series of absences with increasingly prestigious explanations. Mother was in London for a play. Mother was in Paris for a film. Mother was touring. Mother was working. The work was celebrated. The work was important. The work was also and always a departure from wherever the children were. The pattern that had begun in Pia's infancy, a mother who left for professional obligations and returned with stories and warmth and the particular gilt-edged generosity of a parent who knows she has not been there enough, continued through the childhoods of all four children. The difference was that the world was no longer punishing Bergman for the absences. The world was rewarding her. In 1974, Bergman won her third Academy Award, this time for Best Supporting Actress in Murder on the Orient Express. She was 59 years old. The award was a capstone, a confirmation that the restoration was complete. She had now won 3 Oscars across 3 decades, a feat that placed her in the smallest possible company of cinema legends. The American Film Institute would later rank her 4th among the greatest female screen legends, behind only Katharine Hepburn, Bette Davis, and Audrey Hepburn. The moral fury of 1950 was now a historical curiosity. The woman who had been called a powerful influence for evil was now, in the estimation of the industry that had expelled her, one of the greatest artists it had ever produced. But the gathering storm was not professional. It was physical. Bergman had been diagnosed with cancer. The disease would define the last years of her life, and it would become the final iteration of the pattern that had shaped her entire relationship with her children. She would continue working, continue moving, continue being present to the world, and intermittently present to her family, until her body made continuation impossible. She did not retire into illness. She did not withdraw into a quiet domestic ending, surrounded by the children she had brought into the world. She worked, she performed. She kept the camera on her and the audience in front of her because that was who she was, and because the alternative, stillness, domesticity, the closing in of a life that had always been defined by expansion, was something she could not accept even when her body was telling her she had no choice. Her final major film role was in Ingmar Bergman's Autumn Sonata, released in 1978. It was the only time the two Bergmans, Ingrid and Ingmar, no relation despite the surname, worked together, and the film they made was almost unbearably appropriate. Ingrid Bergman played Charlotte, a celebrated concert pianist who visits her adult daughter Eva after years of emotional neglect. Eva, played by Liv Ullmann, confronts her mother with a lifetime of accumulated pain. The absences, the self-absorption, the career that was always more important than the child. Charlotte listens, Charlotte deflects. Charlotte is brilliant and charming, and emotionally devastating in the particular way that mothers who have prioritized their art over their children can be. She is capable of extraordinary feeling in performance and extraordinary obtuseness in relationship. The film is not autobiography. Ingmar Bergman wrote it from his own preoccupations, not from Ingrid's life, but the resonance is impossible to ignore, and the script should not pretend otherwise. An actress who had left children on 2 continents to pursue her art was playing a mother accused, by her daughter, of exactly that abandonment. The confrontation scene, Eva telling Charlotte what it was like to grow up waiting for a mother who was always elsewhere, is one of the most powerful scenes in either Bergman's filmography, and its power comes not from the biographical echo, but from the precision of the writing and the performances. Ingrid Bergman played Charlotte with a complexity that suggested she understood the character from the inside. Whether that understanding was personal recognition or professional mastery or some fusion of both is a question the viewer must sit with, because the film does not answer it, and neither did Bergman. She was 63 when Autumn Sonata was released. She was ill. The cancer was advancing, and the years between Autumn Sonata and her death would be years of continued work. She appeared in the television film A Woman Called Golda in 1982, playing Golda Meir, a performance that would earn her a posthumous Emmy, and continued physical decline. She did not stop. She could not stop. The camera had been her father's love, her livelihood, her identity, her way of being in the world. To stop filming was to stop existing in the way she understood existence. The last years brought the children into closer proximity. Pia, now in her 40s, was established in her career at WNBC in New York. She was a professional woman with her own identity, her own accomplishments, her own daily life that did not depend on her mother's fame. But a mother's dying changes the geometry of every relationship. The practical questions, where, when, how to be present, intersect with the emotional questions that have been accumulating for decades. Pia had spent years building a life separate from Bergman's. Now she was being asked to re-enter the orbit of a woman whose gravitational pull had shaped everything, even the shape of Pia's departure from it. Isabella was approaching 30, already modeling, already beginning the career that would make her one of the most recognizable faces of the 1980s. She had signed with Lancôme. She was beautiful in the specific way that carries a famous inheritance. The face that recalls the mother's face, the presence that reminds the camera of what it once loved. She was also already more than a model. She was intellectually engaged, curious about the world in ways that her modeling career did not accommodate, and that her later life would explore in unexpected directions. But in the early 80s, she was a young woman whose mother was dying, and the knowledge of that dying colored everything. Isotta was the same age, the twin track running parallel. She was in her academic world, teaching, studying, building the scholarly life that would be her contribution to the family's legacy. She was quieter about the dying, as she was quieter about everything. But quietness is not absence of feeling. It is a different container for the same grief. Roberto was in his early 30s. The boy born into scandal was now a man living in the long aftermath of a childhood he had not chosen, carrying a name that still resonated with the history of cinema and the history of moral panic, and facing the imminent loss of the mother who had brought him into the world under circumstances that had shaped his life before he could speak. Roberto Rossellini, the father, was already gone. He had died on the 3rd of June, 1977, of a heart attack, at the age of 71. His death had been sudden. Characteristically sudden, Isabella might have said, the death of a man who had moved through life at speed and left it the same way. Bergman had reportedly remarked that he left as quickly as he drove his Ferrari. The comment had the mordant precision of a woman who had loved a man and been left by him and understood, finally, that his restlessness was not a choice, but a constitution. The children had lost their father 5 years before they would lose their mother. The grief was compounding. The family that had never been architecturally stable was now losing its principles. Ingrid Bergman died on the 29th of August, 1982. It was her 67th birthday. She died in London in the flat she kept in Cheney Gardens, Chelsea. The cancer that had been advancing for years had completed its work. She had finished filming A Woman Called Golda earlier that year, performing through illness with the same determination that had carried her through scandal, exile, and restoration. She had been, until the very end, a woman who worked. The camera had been her first language, taught to her by a father who pointed a lens at a small girl in Stockholm and made her believe that to be seen was to be loved. The camera had been her last language too. She died having given everything she had to the art that had made her immortal and that had, in the process, taken her from the rooms where her children waited. The death was reported around the world. The tributes were immediate and generous. The woman who had once been denounced on the floor of the United States Senate was now eulogized as one of the greatest actresses who had ever lived. The restoration was complete. The public Ingrid Bergman, the legend, the face, the voice, the 3 Academy Awards, the catalog of unforgettable performances was secured forever in the amber of cultural memory. She would be remembered as Ilsa in Casablanca, as the wife in Gaslight, as the spy in Notorious, as the redeemed exile in Anastasia, as the mother in Autumn Sonata. She would be ranked and listed and celebrated. She would become, in the decades after her death, more myth than person, more image than woman, more archive than life. But on the 29th of August, 1982, in a flat in Chelsea, what remained was not a myth. What remained were 4 people who had each lost a mother. Pia Lindström was 43 years old. She had spent the first 12 years of her life with Bergman and the next 7 without her. She had rebuilt the relationship in adulthood with the patience and discipline that defined everything she did. She had never fully resolved the original wound. How could she? But she had found a way to live alongside it, to be Ingrid Bergman's daughter, without being only Ingrid Bergman's abandoned daughter. And now the woman whose absence had shaped her childhood was permanently absent, and the grief had to find a place inside a life that had already been organized around loss. Roberto Rossellini was 32. He had been born into a scandal he did not create, raised in a household that dissolved when he was 7, and had spent his adult life carrying a name that meant more to the world than it could ever mean to him. His mother's death was the second parental loss in 5 years. He was now a man without either of the figures who had made him, left with the archive, the films, the photographs, the home movies, the public record of 2 extraordinary lives, and the private knowledge that the archive could not contain, what it had actually been like to be their son. Isabella Rossellini was 30. She was on the verge of the fame that would make her name as recognizable as her mother's, though in a different register. She would grieve publicly and privately, and she would spend the rest of her life interpreting both parents' legacies. In interviews, in documentaries, in the one-woman shows she would later create, in the choices she made about how to live. She was the child who had inherited the most visible version of the family legacy, the face, the camera, the willingness to be seen. She was also the child who would work hardest to understand what the legacy meant, not as mythology, but as lived experience. Isotta Rossellini was 30, the same age, the same birthday, the same loss. She had spent her life building the counterpoint to Isabella's visibility, and the death of their mother did not change that fundamental orientation. She grieved in the way scholars grieve, by returning to the texts, the languages, the intellectual traditions that had been her alternative architecture. She would continue to teach. She would continue to study. She would carry the family name into lecture halls and seminar rooms, and she would do it quietly, without the cameras that had followed her mother and her sister, without the public narration that the Bergman-Rossellini name seemed to demand. The immediate aftermath of Bergman's death was a convergence. The 4 children, raised in different households on different continents in different languages under different pressures, were now connected not by a living mother, but by the absence of one. The practical matters of death arrived as they always do. The arrangements, the notifications, the press inquiries, the tributes that required responses, the estate that required attention. But beneath the practical surface was something harder and less manageable. 4 people sitting with the same loss and experiencing it differently, because each of them had had a different mother. Pia's mother was the one who left. Roberto's mother was the one who stayed, but was always working. Isabella's mother was the one who came and went and filmed everything. Isotta's mother was the one who was famous and warm and not always there. They were mourning the same woman and 4 different absences. The archive remained, the films, the photographs, the home movies, the letters, the diaries. The accumulation of a life lived in front of cameras and behind them, a life that had been documented with a thoroughness that most lives are not, because this life belonged to a woman who understood, from the age of 2, that the camera was where love lived. Justus Bergman had filmed his daughter in Stockholm. Bergman had filmed her children in Italy and France. The children would later sit before cameras and explain their mother to the world. The instrument of love had become the instrument of record, had become the instrument of reckoning. On the 29th of August, 1982, the reckoning began. But it would not end on that day. It would continue for decades through documentaries and interviews and the slow, careful work of four adults trying to separate the mother from the myth, the private woman from the public legend, the person who had loved them from the person who had left them. The world had completed its forgiveness of Ingrid Bergman. Her children were just beginning the longer, harder work of understanding what there was to forgive and whether forgiveness was even the right word for what they needed. By the time Ingrid Bergman became untouchable again, ranked, revered, permanently installed in the pantheon of cinema's greatest, the four children had already learned what the public never had to learn, that a legend can be restored without a family being repaired. The decades after Bergman's death did not resolve the family's story. They extended it. Each of the four children carried the inheritance forward, not as a single legacy, but as four separate versions of the same unfinished conversation. With a mother who was no longer available to answer, Pia Lindstrom did what she had always done. She built the career at WNBC in New York, which had begun in 1973, continued through the 80s and into the 90s. A quarter century of work in television journalism that would have been remarkable for anyone and was extraordinary for a woman whose first encounter with the press had been as a child at the center of a custody battle reported in international newspapers. She worked as a reporter and anchor. She covered stories. She sat behind desks and spoke into cameras with the composure that had become her signature. And every day of that composure was, in some small way, an answer to the chaos of her childhood. The girl who had been talked about was now the woman who did the talking. The child whose story had been narrated by others was now the professional narrator, controlling the frame, choosing the words, deciding what was said and what was left out. She received Emmy recognition. She won an Associated Press award. She became known in New York, broadcasting as a reliable, intelligent presence, not a celebrity playing at journalism, but a journalist who happened to carry a famous name. The distinction mattered to her. It had to matter, because the alternative, being known only as Ingrid Bergman's abandoned daughter, was the identity she had spent her entire adult life refusing. She had not refused the relationship with her mother. She had not refused the name. She had refused the reduction of herself to a single biographical fact. She was more than the girl who was left behind. She proved it every evening at 6 o'clock, every time she looked into a camera and delivered the news with the authority of a woman who had earned her seat at the desk through work, not inheritance. But inheritance is persistent, and the most significant act of Pia's professional life was also the most intimate. In 1996, she produced Ingrid Bergman Remembered, a documentary about her mother. The project placed her in a position that no one else could occupy, the abandoned daughter as the custodian of the mother's image. She narrated the film. She assembled the archive. She decided which photographs to show, which stories to tell, which version of Bergman to present to an audience that knew the legend but not the woman. The documentary was an act of preservation and, in its own quiet way, an act of authorship. Pia could not change what had happened. She could not restore the years of separation or undo the custody battles or make her childhood other than what it had been. But she could decide how the story was told. She could hold the camera. There is something about that reversal. The child filmed by a mother who left, growing up to make a film about the mother who left, that contains the family's entire emotional architecture in a single professional act. The camera had begun as Justus Bergman's instrument of love. It had become Ingrid Bergman's instrument of mothering. It had become Hollywood's instrument of myth-making. And now it had become Pia's instrument of reckoning. Not revenge, not accusation, reckoning. The steady, composed, professional act of looking at a life and deciding what it meant. Roberto Rossellini, the son, moved through the decades after his mother's death with the quieter trajectory that had characterized his life from the beginning. He had been born louder than anyone. His birth had been a Senate floor event, a newspaper headline, a moral crisis, and then he had spent the rest of his life at a lower volume. He did not pursue his mother's profession or his father's. He did not become the public face of anything. He lived. He participated in family gatherings and in the documentaries that periodically revisited his parents' legacies. He appeared on screen not as a performer, but as a witness, a man whose presence in front of a camera was valuable not for what he did, but for what he represented. The human being behind the headline, the adult version of the infant who had once been treated as evidence of moral collapse. His life after Bergman's death was not defined by her absence in the way that Pia's childhood had been defined by it. He had grown up with his mother nearby, if not always present. He had known her in the Italian years, in the household with the babysitter and the housekeeper, in the home movies on the beach. His grief was real, but differently shaped. The grief of a son who had always shared his mother with the world and who now shared only her memory. He carried the name Roberto Rossellini into decades where it meant less the scandal of 1950 and more the legacy of two parents who had changed cinema and left a complicated family in their wake. Isabella Rossellini became, in the years after her mother's death, the family member the world watched most closely. She had already begun modeling before Bergman died, but the 1980s transformed her from a working model into a global icon. She became the face of Lancôme, a cosmetics contract that placed her image on billboards and magazine covers around the world and that carried, whether she intended it or not, the ghost of her mother's face. People looked at Isabella and saw Ingrid. The resemblance was not exact, but it was close enough that the comparison was inescapable, and Isabella spent years navigating the particular challenge of being famous for a face that reminded everyone of someone else. She did not let the comparison define her. She acted in David Lynch's Blue Velvet in 1986, a performance that was as far from her mother's Hollywood elegance as it was possible to get, and in dozens of other films that demonstrated a range and a willingness to take risks that was entirely her own. She modeled with an intelligence that treated beauty as a subject to be interrogated rather than simply displayed. And then, in the way that only someone with her particular combination of restlessness and curiosity could manage, she turned away from the industries that had made her famous and towards something nobody expected. She went back to school. She studied animal behavior. She developed a fascination with ethology, the science of animal conduct in natural environments, and she began creating one-woman theatrical shows about Darwin, about genetics, about the reproductive strategies of different species, performances that were funny and strange and intellectually serious, and that bore no resemblance whatsoever to anything her mother or father had done. She was not imitating either parent, she was synthesizing them. Her mother's love of performance and her father's intellectual ambition fused in these shows into something entirely new, a form that was neither cinema, nor theater, nor lecture, but some hybrid that only Isabella could have invented. She settled on Long Island, she acquired a farm, she raised heritage breed chickens, and collaborated with her daughter, Elettra Wiedemann, on food and agriculture projects through what became known as Mama Farm. The actress who had been the face of Lancôme was now raising livestock and talking about sustainable food systems, and the transition was not a contradiction, but a continuation. She had inherited her parents' refusal to be contained by a single identity, and she was expressing it in the most literal way possible by living on the land, working with animals, and treating the farm as another form of creative practice. In 2025, Isabella sat for an interview that provided a window into the present tense of the family's story. She spoke from Long Island. She remembered both parents. She described the domestic arrangements after the separation. The flat, the babysitter, the mother coming and going, the father nearby. With the matter-of-factness of a woman who had spent decades processing a childhood that was extraordinary and in its own way ordinary. She spoke about a new documentary about her father, living without a script, and about the experience of revisiting his legacy from the vantage point of her 70s. She described telling her father when she was younger that she had secretly seen some of his films and watching his eyes fill with tears. The detail is small and devastating in the specific way that family details are devastating. A father who did not know his daughter had seen his work, moved to tears by the discovery. The emotional distance inside that anecdote, the secrecy, the father's surprise, the tears, captures something about the Rossellini household that no biography could state as efficiently. Even the love was complicated, even the closeness contained gaps. Isotta Rossellini continued on the path she had chosen in childhood. She taught. She studied Italian literature. She held positions at Columbia, at Princeton, at New York University. She became the family's scholar, the twin who carried the name not into flashbulbs but into footnotes, not onto screens but onto syllabi. Her academic career was distinguished and deliberate, the work of a woman who had decided early that her inheritance would be intellectual rather than performative, and who had spent her life honoring that decision. She was the counterweight the family needed. In a dynasty built on image, on the camera, the face, the screen, the relentless machinery of looking and being looked at, Isotta was the one who stepped out of the frame. Her contribution was preservation of a different kind. Not the preservation of the image, but the preservation of the language, the text, the literary tradition that ran beneath the surface of the family's more visible legacies. She proved simply by living the life she lived that the Bergman-Rossellini inheritance could be carried quietly, that the name did not require spectacle, that a twin could share a birthday and an origin and a childhood and still become an entirely separate person. The cultural afterlife of the family's story began almost immediately after Bergman's death and has continued without interruption. The first major document was Bergman's own, Ingrid Bergman, My Story, the memoir she wrote with Alan Burgess, published in 1980. It was her version, the actress's version, shaped by a woman who understood narrative and who knew that the story of her life would be told whether she told it or not. The book was intimate, carefully constructed, and revealing in the way she chose to be revealing. It established the terms on which Bergman wanted to be understood, as a woman who had followed her heart, made mistakes, paid for them, and survived. Pia's 1996 documentary, Ingrid Bergman Remembered, was the daughter's answer, not a rebuttal. The tone was too measured for that, but a different angle of vision, the mother seen from the position of the child who had waited. The fact that Pia narrated it herself gave the documentary its particular emotional charge. This was not a journalist or a biographer telling Bergman's story. This was the girl who had been left behind, now a woman in her 50s, deciding what the leaving meant. The most significant cultural document came in 2015, on the centenary of Bergman's birth. Stig Björkman directed Ingrid Bergman, in her own words, a documentary built from the raw materials of Bergman's private life. Her letters, her diaries, her photographs, and the home movies, the 8mm and 16mm footage that Bergman had shot throughout her life. Filming her children, her homes, her travels, the daily texture of an existence that it was extraordinary, and in the moments the home camera caught, ordinary. The film was selected for Cannes Classics. The Criterion Collection released it with an essay that identified the documentary's particular achievement. It showed Bergman whole, not as the scandal or the legend, but as a woman whose life contained both and could not be reduced to either. All 4 children appeared in the documentary. They sat before cameras and the same instrument that had defined their mother's life, the same instrument their grandfather had used in Stockholm, the same instrument that had recorded their childhoods on beaches and in gardens. And they spoke about the woman who had raised them, left them, loved them, and died. Their testimony was bittersweet in the precise way that the children of extraordinary parents are bittersweet. They had been given much, including proximity to genius and beauty and creative intensity. And they had also been given the knowledge that they were never the only claim on their mother's attention. The world had always been there, wanting her too. The Ingrid Bergman collection at Wesleyan University became the physical repository of the family's archive, not just the professional materials, the scripts and contracts and production photographs, but the private materials, the family snapshots, the baby pictures, the letters, the garments, the small objects that accumulate in a life and that become, after death, the evidence of a person who was once here. The archive is the closest thing this dynasty has to a country house. The place where the public can walk through the rooms of a private life and try to understand who lived there. What remains today is not a single family, but 4 lives that share an origin and occupy different worlds. Pia Lindström is in her late 80s now. She is retired from her main broadcasting career, living with the knowledge that she outlasted both the scandal that defined her childhood and the career that defined her adulthood. She is the eldest of Bergman's children, the one who remembers the before, the one whose wound was the oldest and whose composure was the most hard-won. She is the woman who held the camera last, who produced the documentary, who decided how the mother would be remembered. Whether she found peace with Bergman's choices or simply found a way to live alongside the question is something only she knows. The public record shows a woman who built a life of accomplishment and dignity. What the public record cannot show is what it cost. Roberto Rossellini is in his mid-70s. He is the son whose birth changed everything and who spent his life being something more ordinary and more dignified than the headline that greeted his arrival. He has participated in family documentaries and has maintained a connection to both parents' legacies without being consumed by either. He is the quietest thread in the story, and the quietness is not insignificance. It is the particular achievement of a man who was born into noise and chose or managed to live at a lower volume. Isabella Rossellini is 73 years old. She lives on Long Island. She acts, she performs, she raises animals. She collaborates with her daughter Elettra on Mama Farm and speaks about food and sustainability, with the same intensity her mother brought to acting and her father brought to intellectual argument. Her son, also named Roberto Rossellini, has worked in fashion photography and modeling and is connected to the farm as well. Isabella is the family member who most obviously carries both parents forward, not as imitation, but as synthesis, the face and the restlessness and the refusal to be one thing fused into a life that is, by any standard, extraordinary and entirely her own. She still speaks about her parents in interviews. She still sits before cameras. She still does what the family has always done. She looks and she allows herself to be looked at, and she tries to make the looking mean something. Isotta Rossellini is 73, the same age, the same birthday, a different life. She is associated with scholarship and Italian literature, with the universities where she taught, with the intellectual tradition she chose over the performative one. She is the twin who proved that the inheritance could be carried differently, that the name did not have to mean the camera, that a Rossellini could live in the world of text rather than the world of images. She is in some ways the family member closest to the archive. Not the visual archive of films and photographs, but the written archive of letters and diaries and the literary traditions that gave the family's Italian years their intellectual texture. What physically remains is not an estate. There is no country house, no ancestral land, no title to be passed. What remains is footage. Reels of 8mm film, 16mm home movies, studio negatives, letters in Swedish, English, Italian, and French, diaries written in hotel rooms and on film sets, photographs of children on beaches, of a woman laughing, of a man behind a camera, of a family that existed in frames because the people in it understood, before they understood anything else, that the frame was where life was preserved. The Wesleyan Archive holds it all. The documentaries have shown some of it. The rest waits in boxes and cans and climate-controlled rooms, the physical residue of lives that were lived in front of lenses and that survive now as light on celluloid, images fixed in the chemistry of a century that believed, as Justus Bergman believed when he pointed his camera at a 2-year-old girl in Stockholm, that if you could capture someone on film, you could keep them. You could not, of course. Justus died and the films remained and the girl grew up and lost him anyway. Bergman filmed her children and then left them, and the footage survived the leaving but did not prevent it. The children sat before cameras decades later and explained the mother who had filmed them, and the cameras recorded their explanations, and the recordings were archived, and somewhere in that infinite regression of looking and being looked at is the truth of this family. They could not stop filming, and they could not stop leaving, and the films were always more permanent than the presence. Ingrid Bergman's children inherited beauty, talent, famous names, multiple languages, access to the history of cinema, and a place inside the cultural memory of the 20th century. They also inherited absence, explanation, and the lifelong task of separating the woman from the legend. There is no neat moral to their story. Bergman was not only selfish, and she was not only brave. Pia was not only the abandoned daughter, Isabella was not only the famous twin, Isotta was not only the quiet one, Roberto was not only the scandal child, they were all living inside the same impossible fact that the public forgave Ingrid Bergman as legend, but children do not experience a mother as a legend. They experience whether she comes home. And the answer, for all 4 of them, at different times and in different ways, was that she came home sometimes and sometimes she did not, and the camera was always rolling. And the footage is all that is left of the question.